In 1993, 6 kids vanished from a school field trip to the State Museum in Ashford. Teachers counted heads boarding the bus at 2 p.m., but when they arrived back at the school at 3:15, only 4 kids got off. 19 years later, a retired bus driver, sorting through boxes in his garage, found a small spiral notebook that had slipped under a seat. Inside were 6 names, 6 seat numbers, and a single sentence in a child's handwriting that read, "The man said to write this down before 2:45 or we couldn't come back." The museum trip was supposed to be simple. 23 third graders from Ashford Elementary, 2 teachers, 4 parent chaperones. The bus left the school at 1:15 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in early May. The sky was clear. Temperature 68 degrees. Perfect weather for a field trip. Mrs. Dalton, the lead teacher, had organized the trip 3 months in advance. She'd called the museum, arranged the tour, sent permission slips home in February. Every child returned the forms. Every parent signed. The museum was 31 miles away in a town called Riverside, a small collection of historical exhibits in a converted train station. The bus arrived at 1:50 p.m. It pulled into Space 9 in the museum parking lot, a cracked asphalt area with faded yellow lines, and a row of maple trees along the eastern edge. 23 kids filed off. Mrs. Dalton counted them as they stepped down. She made a check mark on her clipboard after each name. 23 check marks. They entered through the main doors at 1:52 p.m. The museum was dim inside, cool and dusty. The ceiling was high, exposed beams running the length of the building. The exhibits were arranged in a rough circle, pioneer life to the left, fossils straight ahead, a replica general store to the right, and a small room in the back dedicated to local railroad history. The kids moved in groups of 5 or 6. Chaperones followed. Mrs. Dalton walked among them, checking to make sure everyone stayed together. She divided them before leaving the school. Group A through Group E. Each group had a chaperone and a clipboard with a worksheet. The worksheet asked simple questions. What year was the town founded? How many fossils are displayed? What items are in the general store? At 1:58 p.m., Mrs. Dalton gathered everyone near the exit. She did another head count. 23. She glanced at her watch. They were ahead of schedule. She told the kids they had 2 minutes to use the restroom or get water before heading back to the bus. At 2 p.m., they filed out. The bus was still in Space 9. Earl Voss, the driver, was standing by the door. He watched them board. He counted as they climbed the steps. 23. Earl had been driving District 4 routes for 14 years. He was 51 years old, steady, reliable. He knew every road in the county. He knew which routes had rough patches, which intersections had poor visibility, which stretches flooded after heavy rain. He'd driven this museum route 60 times that school year alone. The kids settled into their seats. Mrs. Dalton sat in the front row, passenger side. A chaperone, named Linda Marsh, sat across the aisle. 2 other chaperones, Paul Vega and Susan Oakes, sat in the middle of the bus. The 4th chaperone, Richard Brennan, sat in the back. Earl closed the door. He adjusted the rear-view mirror. He started the engine. At 2 p.m. exactly, he pulled out of the parking lot and turned left onto Museum Road. The route back was straightforward. Museum Road to State Route. 22 north for 26 miles, then east onto County Road 14 for the final 5 miles to the school. No stops, except for one 4-way intersection at Bellwood Road, mile marker 41 on Route 22. The ride was quiet at first. Some kids looked out the windows, others whispered to seatmates. A few pulled out the worksheets and compared answers. Mrs. Dalton turned in her seat and reminded them to keep voices down. Earl kept his eyes on the road. At 2:05 p.m., they passed through the town of Carver, a cluster of houses, a gas station, a post office. The bus rolled through without slowing. The speed limit on Route 22 was 55. Earl kept it at 52. At 2:12 p.m., they passed a farm with a red barn and a silo. A black and white cow stood near the fence. 3 kids on the right side of the bus pointed at it. Earl glanced in the mirror. Everyone seemed fine. At 2:18 p.m., the bus hit a small pothole. The rearview mirror shook loose from its mount. Earl stood up, keeping one hand on the wheel. The bus was coasting downhill on a straight stretch. No other traffic. He reached up, tightened the bracket, sat back down. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. Linda Marsh noticed. She glanced at Earl and he gave a small nod. At 2:23 p.m. they passed the same farm with the red barn again. Earl frowned. That didn't make sense. They should have been miles past Carver by now. He checked the speedometer. 52. He checked the road signs. Route 22 north. Mile marker 38. Wait. They'd passed mile marker 41 at 2:18. Now they were at mile marker 38. Earl's hands tightened on the wheel. He glanced in the mirror. The kids looked normal. A few were sleeping. Others were still looking out the windows. He glanced at Mrs. Dalton. She was talking to Linda, facing forward. She hadn't noticed anything. Earl checked his watch. 2:23 p.m. He kept driving. At 2:34 p.m., they reached the 4-way stop at Bellwood Road. Earl slowed. He checked left, right. No cross traffic. He rolled through and continued north. He glanced at the mile marker as they passed. 41. That was right. They were back on track. He checked his watch again. 2:34 p.m. He exhaled slowly. At 2:41 p.m., they turned onto County Road 14, 2 miles to the school. Earl kept his speed steady. Everything felt normal now. The road was familiar. The landmarks matched. He passed the Johnsons' farm, the old church with the blue roof, the abandoned gas station with the broken sign. At 3:15 p.m., the bus pulled into the school parking lot. Earl opened the door. Mrs. Dalton stood. She told the kids to gather their things. One by one they filed down the aisle and stepped off the bus. Mrs. Dalton counted. 1, 2, 3. She stopped. She counted again. 17. She looked at her clipboard. 23 names. She called them out loud. Tyler Brennan? No answer. Cassie Lim? No answer. Jordan Fell? Maya Oakes? Chris Dunn? Nora Vega? Silence. Mrs. Dalton's voice went tight. She turned to Earl. Did any of them get off at the museum? Earl shook his head. No, I counted 23 when they boarded. They were all on the bus. Mrs. Dalton walked down the aisle. She checked every seat. Empty. She checked the narrow bathroom in the back. She returned to the front, her face pale. They're gone. Linda Marsh stood up. That's not possible. Paul Vega and Susan Oakes moved through the bus, checking under seats, behind seats, nothing. Richard Brennan, sitting in the back, said quietly, I didn't see anyone get off. Earl said, the bus never stopped, only at the Bellwood intersection, and no one got off there. Mrs. Dalton's hand shook as she reached for her phone. At 3:22 p.m., the school office called the parents of the missing 6. At 3:40 p.m., police arrived. At 4 p.m., the bus was cordoned off with yellow tape. The missing 6, Tyler Brennan, age 8, seat 7, Cassie Lim, age 9, seat 12, Jordan Fell, age 8, seat 14, Maya Oakes, age 9, seat 18, Chris Dunn, age 8, seat 20, Nora Vega, age 9, seat 22. Detective Raymond Shaw took the lead. He was 43, a 12-year veteran of the Ashford Police Department. He'd worked missing persons cases before. Runaways, custody disputes, one drowning. Never anything like this. He started with Earl. They sat in the school office. Shaw asked him to walk through the entire trip, minute by minute. Earl described the route. Museum Road to Route 22, north to County Road 14, east to the school. He described the stop at Bellwood Road. He described standing up to fix the mirror at 2:18 p.m. Shaw asked if he'd seen anyone approach the bus at the museum. Earl said no. Shaw asked if he'd stopped anywhere else. Earl said no. Shaw asked if anyone had gotten on or off. Earl said no. Shaw asked about the kids. Had any of them seemed upset? Had any of them acted strangely? Earl said no. He said they'd been normal, quiet, some sleeping, some talking, normal. Shaw asked about the time. Earl said they'd left the museum at 2 p.m. and arrived at the school at 3:15 p.m. Shaw did the math. 75 minutes. He asked how long the trip usually took. Earl said 37 to 40 minutes, depending on traffic. Shaw wrote that down. Where had the extra 35 minutes gone? Earl hesitated. He said he didn't know. He said the trip had felt normal. He said he'd checked his watch at 2 o'clock, at 2:34, and at 3:15. Everything had seemed fine. Shaw asked about the mirror incident at 2:18. How long had Earl been standing? Earl said less than 30 seconds, maybe 20. Shaw asked if the bus had slowed or stopped during that time. Earl said no. It had been coasting downhill. Straight road, no traffic. Shaw thanked him and moved on to Mrs. Dalton. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Shaw asked her to describe the head counts. She said she'd counted at the museum exit at 1:58 p.m. 23. She'd counted again as they boarded the bus. 23. She'd counted when they got off. 17. Shaw asked if she'd watched the kids during the ride. She said no. She'd been sitting in the front, talking to Linda Marsh. She hadn't been looking at the back of the bus. Shaw asked if she'd noticed anything unusual, any sounds, any movements. She said no. It had been quiet. Normal. Shaw interviewed Linda Marsh next. She confirmed Mrs. Dalton's account. She said she'd been facing forward the whole time. She hadn't seen anything strange. Paul Vega and Susan Oakes gave similar statements. They'd been sitting in the middle. They'd been talking quietly. They hadn't noticed anything. Richard Brennan, the chaperone in the back, was the last adult Shaw interviewed. Richard was Tyler Brennan's father. His face was gray. His hands wouldn't stop moving. Shaw asked if he'd seen anything. Richard said no. He said he'd been sitting in seat 23, the very back row. He said some of the kids near him had been talking. He said Jordan and Chris had been whispering about something. Maybe the worksheets, maybe the exhibits. He said Maya had been looking out the window. He said Tyler had been reading a book. Shaw asked about Cassie and Nora. Richard said they'd been sitting farther forward. He hadn't been watching them. Shaw asked if anyone had gotten up or moved around. Richard said no. Shaw asked if Richard had fallen asleep at any point. Richard hesitated. He said maybe, just for a minute. He said he'd been tired. He said he'd closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the bus was pulling into the school. Shaw asked what time he'd closed his eyes. Richard said he wasn't sure. Maybe 2:30, maybe earlier. Shaw asked what time he'd opened them. Richard said 3:15. Right as they arrived, Shaw wrote that down. Next, Shaw interviewed the 17 kids who'd returned. He did it gently, one at a time, with parents present. He asked them simple questions. Did you see the missing kids on the bus? Did you see them get off? Did anything seem strange? Most of the kids said no. They said everything had been normal. Some said they'd been sleeping. Others said they'd been looking out the windows or talking to friends. 3 kids gave slightly different answers. The first was a boy named Ben Ruiz, age 8, seat 11. He said he remembered feeling like the ride took a long time. He said he'd fallen asleep, and when he woke up, it felt like hours had passed, but his watch said it had only been a few minutes. The second was a girl named Lily Ortiz, age 9, seat 4. She said she remembered looking back at one point and feeling like some of the seats were empty, but then she looked again and everyone was there. She said she thought maybe she'd imagined it. The third was a boy named Marcus Chen, age 8, seat 16. He said he remembered seeing a man standing in the aisle near the back, but when he blinked, the man was gone. Shaw asked what the man looked like. Marcus said he didn't know. Tall, maybe. Dark clothes. He said it had been quick, like a shadow. Shaw requested the security footage from the museum. The museum manager brought it on a VHS tape. Shaw watched it in the school office. The footage showed the bus arriving at 1:50 p.m. It showed the kids getting off, entering the museum, exiting at 2 p.m., boarding the bus. The camera angle didn't show inside the bus, but it showed the door. Shaw counted. 23 kids got off. 23 kids got on. No one else approached the bus. No other vehicles pulled in or out during that window. Shaw requested Earl's route log. Earl kept a daily log of every trip, departure times, arrival times, incidents. Shaw found the entry for May 4th. Departed museum 2 p.m. Arrived school 3:15 p.m. No incidents. Shaw requested the school's arrival log. 2 staff members had been standing outside when the bus pulled in. Both confirmed 3:15 p.m. Shaw checked weather records. Clear skies. No rain, no fog. Shaw checked traffic reports. No accidents, no delays, no road work on Route 22 or County Road 14. At 5:30 p.m., Shaw called in a canine unit. 2 dogs arrived at 6 p.m. They swept the bus from front to back. Both dogs alerted on 6 seats 7, 12, 14, 18, 22. They alerted on nothing else. Shaw requested a forensic team. They arrived at 7 p.m. and worked through the night. They dusted for fingerprints. They swabbed for blood. They pulled floor mats and checked the undercarriage. They found prints from dozens of kids, layers of them, overlapping. They found no blood, no hair, no fibers that seemed out of place. On seat 12, they found a small indentation in the vinyl, as if someone had been pressing hard on something. The techs photographed it. The indentation was roughly the size of a notebook page. On seat 14, they found a juice box on the floor, still half full. Tyler's mother confirmed it was the kind she'd packed in his lunch. On seat 22, they found a crumpled worksheet. The handwriting matched Nora's samples from school. At 3 a.m., Shaw called off the search for the night. He told the team to reconvene at 7 a.m. He went home. He didn't sleep. On May 5th, Shaw assembled a search team, 30 volunteers, split into 3 groups. They combed the route from the museum to the school, walking both sides of Route 22 and County Road 14. They looked for clothing, shoes, backpacks, any sign someone had jumped or been pushed from the bus. They found nothing. Shaw requested a helicopter from the county. It flew the route at 11 a.m., cameras rolling. The footage showed farmland, trees, the occasional house, no bodies, no disturbances. Shaw visited the 4-way stop at Bellwood Road. It was a rural crossroads, cornfields on 3 sides, a small white church with a gravel parking lot on the 4th. The church was called Bellwood Community Chapel. Shaw checked the door. Locked. He walked the perimeter. He checked the parking lot, empty except for a few weeds growing through the cracks. He called the county clerk's office and requested information on the church. They told him it was still active. Services on Sundays, maintained by a caretaker named Leonard Goss. Shaw requested Leonard's contact information. The clerk gave him an address 2 miles west of the church. Shaw drove there. It was a small house, white with green shutters, set back from the road. A pickup truck sat in the driveway. Shaw knocked. Leonard Goss answered. He was 65 years old, thin with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Shaw's badge and nodded slowly. Shaw asked if Leonard had been near the church on May 4th, around 2:34 p.m. Leonard said no. He said he'd been home. Shaw asked if Leonard had seen the bus go through the intersection. Leonard said no. He said he didn't usually watch the road. Shaw asked how long Leonard had been the church caretaker. Leonard said 30 years. Shaw asked if anything unusual had ever happened at the intersection. Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Define unusual." Shaw said, "Anything out of the ordinary. Accidents, strange occurrences, things people talk about." Leonard said, "People don't talk much about Bellwood. Nothing happens here." Shaw thanked him and left. On May 6th, Shaw requested the school records for all 23 kids. He wanted to see if there was any connection between the missing 6 shared classes, shared activities, anything that might explain why those specific kids had vanished. The records showed nothing. The 6 kids were in different homerooms. They had different schedules. Some were on the soccer team. Others weren't. Some were in the school band. Others weren't. The only thing they had in common was the field trip. Shaw interviewed the parents separately. Tyler's father, Richard, could barely speak. Tyler's mother, Angela, asked the same question over and over. "Where is my son?" Cassie's mother, Janet Lim, was eerily calm. She said Cassie had been excited about the trip. She said Cassie had packed her own lunch, had chosen her yellow jacket because it was her favorite. She said Cassie had hugged her that morning and said, "I'll see you at 3:30. Jordan's parents, both teachers, asked detailed questions about the timeline, the route, the search efforts. They wanted maps. They wanted data. Maya's mother, Susan Oakes, one of the chaperones, sat in her living room and stared at the wall. She said she'd been 20 feet away from her daughter. She said she'd been on the same bus. She said she didn't understand. Chris's parents were divorced. Shaw interviewed them separately. The father, Michael Dunn, said Chris had been staying with him that week. He said Chris had been quiet lately, spending a lot of time drawing. Shaw asked to see the drawings. Michael brought out a sketchbook. Most of the pages showed simple things: cars, houses, trees. One page showed a bus with empty seats. Nora's parents, Paul and Elena Vega, said Nora had been talking about the museum trip for weeks. She'd been reading books about fossils, about trains, about history. She'd made a list of questions she wanted to ask the tour guide. Shaw asked if Nora had seemed nervous or scared. They said no. She'd been excited. On May 7th, a child psychologist named Dr. Laura Finch arrived from the state office. She interviewed the 17 kids who'd returned, looking for signs of trauma, gaps in memory, anything that might suggest what had happened. Most of the kids seemed fine. Confused, but fine. They didn't understand why their classmates were missing. They didn't remember anything strange. Dr. Finch asked them to draw pictures of the bus ride. She gave them blank paper and crayons and told them to draw whatever they remembered. 14 kids drew normal scenes: rows of seats, windows, a driver, kids sitting and talking. 3 kids drew something different. Ben Ruiz drew the bus with a figure standing in the aisle. The figure was tall and dark, with no face. Ben said he didn't know why he drew it. He said he just felt like someone had been there. Lily Ortiz drew rows of seats with small clouds above 6 of them. When Dr. Finch asked what the clouds meant, Lily said, "That's where they went." Marcus Chen drew the bus from above, as if looking down through the roof. He drew X marks on seats 7, 12, 14, 18, 20, and 22. When Dr. Finch asked why, Marcus said, "Because they weren't there anymore." Dr. Finch included the drawings in her report. She noted that the 3 kids who drew unusual images had been sitting in different parts of the bus. Ben in the middle, Lily near the front, Marcus near the back. She noted that none of them had spoken to each other about what they'd drawn. On May 10th, the case went cold. The FBI reviewed the file and found no evidence of abduction, no signs of foul play, no leads. The 6 kids had simply vanished. The local papers ran stories for 2 weeks. Parents held vigils. Search teams combed the woods near Route 22. Divers checked Ash River, which ran parallel to County Road 14. They found nothing. By June, the stories stopped. The search teams disbanded. The bus was decommissioned and sold to a salvage yard in Carver. Earl Voss continued driving for 2 more years, then retired in 1995. Mrs. Dalton transferred to another school in 1996. Mrs. Dalton transferred to another school in 1996. The parents never stopped looking. Flyers went up across 3 counties. Tyler's face on telephone poles. Cassie's face in gas station windows. Jordan, Maya, Chris, Nora, all smiling in school photos, all missing. Tips came in for years. Someone saw a boy who looked like Tyler at a rest stop in Pennsylvania. Someone saw a girl who looked like Maya at a grocery store in Ohio. None of the tips led anywhere. Janet Lim hired a private investigator in 1995. He worked the case for 6 months and found nothing. She hired another in 1998. Same result. Richard Brennan divorced his wife in 1997. He moved to another state. Angela stayed in Ashford, keeping Tyler's room exactly as he'd left it. In 2003, Bellwood Community Chapel closed. The congregation had dwindled to less than 20. The building was sold to a man named Harold Veck, who planned to renovate it. He never did. The church sat empty, windows boarded, paint peeling. Leonard Goss died in 2001. Heart failure. He was 73. He'd lived alone. No surviving family. His house was sold. His belongings were donated or thrown away. In 2012, Earl Voss was 70 years old and moving to a smaller house. He'd been packing for weeks, sorting through boxes in his garage. Most of it was junk, old tools, Christmas decorations, things he'd been meaning to throw away for years. At the bottom of a box labeled Bus Misc, he found a small spiral notebook with a generic blue cover. He didn't remember putting it there. He opened it. On the first page, in careful print, were 6 names: Tyler Brennan, Cassie Lim, Jordan Fell, Maya Oakes, Chris Dunn, Nora Vega. Next to each name was a seat number 7, 12, 14, 18, 2022. Below that, in a child's handwriting, was a single sentence. The man said to write this down before 2:45 or we couldn't come back. Earl stared at it for a long time. Then he called the Ashford Police Department. Detective Sarah Klein drove to Earl's house that afternoon. She'd been a rookie in 1993, fresh out of the academy, assigned to traffic duty while senior detectives handled the missing kids case. She'd watched from the periphery, the search teams, the press conferences, the parents crying in the station lobby. 19 years later, she was the lead investigator on cold cases. Earl met her at the door. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were sharp. He handed her the notebook without a word. She photographed every page. The notebook had 5 pages of writing. The first page had the names, seat numbers, and the sentence about the man. The second page had a rough drawing of the bus, interior rows of seats sketched in pencil, with 6 seats circled and labeled with initials: TB, CL, NE a CF, Missouri, CD, Nevada. The third page had a list of times, written in the same child's handwriting: 2:05, 2:12, 2:18, 2:23, 2:34, 2:41. The fourth page had a single word repeated 6 times, stacked vertically: Bellwood, 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 Bellwood. The fifth page was blank, except for a small smudged fingerprint in the bottom right corner. Klein asked Earl where he'd found it. He said it had been in a box of things from the bus: a first aid kit, a route map, some lost and found items he'd kept meaning to return. He said he didn't remember the notebook being there. He said he would have noticed it in 1993. Klein asked if anyone else had access to the box. Earl said no. It had been in his garage since 1995, untouched. She thanked him and left. Back at the station, Sickling ran the fingerprint through the database. No match. She cross-referenced the times on the third page with Earl's original statement from 1993. At 2:05 p.m. the bus had been passing through Carver. At 2:12 p.m., they'd merged onto Route 22. At 2:18 p.m., Earl had stood to adjust the mirror. At 2:23 p.m., they'd passed the farm with the red barn. At 2:34 p.m., they'd rolled through the four-way stop at Bellwood Road. At 2:41 p.m., they'd turned onto County Road 14. Every time matched. Klein requested the original case file. She found Mrs. Dalton's attendance sheet, the museum security footage report, the canine unit findings, the forensic analysis. She found the drawings from the 17 kids, including the 3 unusual ones from Ben, Lily, and Marcus. She found Earl's rote log. She found the school's arrival log. She found the weather report and the traffic report. She did not find any mention of a notebook. Klein contacted the forensic team that had processed the bus in 1993. 2 of the techs were retired. 1 had died. The 4th, a woman named Patricia Morse, was still working for the county lab. Klein showed her the notebook photo. Patricia studied it. She said the team had found an indentation on seat 12, consistent with someone pressing hard while writing. She said they'd photographed it but hadn't found the object that made it. Klein asked if the notebook could have been overlooked. Patricia said it was possible. She said the bus had been full of papers, worksheets, permission slips, drawings. She said if the notebook had been wedged under a seat or fallen into a gap, they might have missed it. Klein requested a handwriting analysis. She sent scans of the notebook pages to a specialist in Millbrook, a woman named Dr. Ellen Cho who'd worked on forgery cases for 20 years. Dr. Cho called back 3 days later. She said the handwriting on the first, third, and fourth pages was consistent with a child between ages 8 and 10. She said the pressure on the paper suggested the writer had been pressing hard, possibly nervous or scared. She said the letter formation was careful, deliberate. Someone trying to write neatly. Klein requested the original missing persons files for the 6 kids. She found school records, handwriting samples from assignments and tests. She compared them to the notebook. The handwriting matched Cassie Lim's. Silane sat at her desk and stared at the comparison for an hour, the loops in the L's, with a slant of the miss. The way the B's curved. It was Cassie's handwriting. No question. She called Janet Lim. Janet was 57 now. She'd never remarried. She still lived in the same house, still kept Cassie's room untouched, posters on the walls, books on the shelf, clothes in the closet. Klein drove to her house the next morning. She brought printed scans of the notebook pages. She didn't explain what they were. She just asked Janet to look at them. Janet's hands started shaking before she even reached the second page. She said, "That's Cassie's handwriting." Klein asked if she was sure. Janet said yes. She said Cassie had always pressed too hard when she wrote. She said Cassie's teachers used to send notes home about it, how she'd leave dents in the paper, how she'd break pencil points. Jacqueline asked if Janet recognized the sentence about the man. Janet said no. She asked if Cassie had ever mentioned anyone named Bellwood. Janet said no. She asked if Cassie had ever talked about field trips or buses in any unusual way. Janet said no. She said Cassie had loved school. She said Cassie had been excited about the museum trip. She said that morning, Cassie had come downstairs wearing her yellow jacket and said, "Mom, I'm going to learn about fossils today." Janet started crying. Klein waited. After a few minutes, Janet asked, "Where did you find this?" Klein explained. "The retired bus driver. The box in the garage. 19 years. Janet asked, What does it mean? Klein said she didn't know. She said she was going to find out. The line requested the full incident report from May 1993. She found Detective Shaw's notes, pages of interviews, observations, theories. Shaw had retired in 2008. Celine called him. Shaw was 62, living in Florida. He remembered the case immediately. He said it was the one that had kept him up at night for years. He said he'd never been able to explain it. Celine told him about the notebook. Shaw was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I interviewed that bus driver for 3 hours. He never mentioned a notebook." Klein, said Earl, claimed he'd never seen it before. Shaw said, "Then, how did it get in his garage?" Klein said she didn't know. Shaw asked if she'd checked the times. Colin said yes, they matched Earl's statement. Shaw said, "So the kid, Cassie, wrote down the exact times the bus passed specific landmarks." Lynn said yes. Shaw said, "While she was missing?" Klein said, "I don't think she was missing. I think she was on the bus the whole time." Shaw said, "Then, where were the other 17 kids?" Klein didn't have an answer. Shaw said, "Check Bellwood Road. Something happened there." Klein drove to Bellwood Road the next day. The intersection looked the same as it had in 1993. Cornfields, the closed church, a cracked four-way stop. She parked on the shoulder and walked the perimeter. The church was in worse shape now. The white paint was peeling. The windows were boarded. The steeple was missing shingles. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds. Klein tried the door. Locked. She peered through a crack in one of the boards. Inside, she could see pews covered in dust. A lectern tipped on its side. She checked county records again. The church had been sold in 2003 to Harold Veck. She requested his contact information. The clerk said Harold was in a nursing facility in Carver. Cleety drove there. Harold was 81 now, in a wheelchair. His memory slipping. She asked about the church. He said he'd bought it years ago, planning to fix it up. He'd never gotten around to it. She asked if he'd ever been inside. He said once or twice. Nothing interesting. Just an old building. She asked if he knew who'd owned it before him. He said the church congregation, as far as he knew. Celine went back to the county clerk. She requested the full ownership history. The church had been built in 1967, owned by the Bellwood Community Chapel congregation until 2003, then sold to Harold Veck. Before 2003, the building had been maintained by a caretaker named Leonard Goss. Klein recognized the name from Shaw's notes. Shaw had interviewed Leonard in 1993. Leonard had said nothing unusual ever happened at Bellwood. Tolman requested Leonard's records. He died in 2001. No surviving family. His house had been sold. His belongings had been dispersed. Caroline found the address of Leonard's old house. It was 2 miles west of the church, still standing, occupied by renters. She knocked. A young couple answered. The woman was pregnant. The man was holding a toddler. Klein showed her badge and explained she was looking into an old case. She asked if they'd found anything unusual when they moved in. The man said, no. The woman said there was some old furniture in the basement. They'd been meaning to get rid of it. Klein asked if she could look. They said sure. The basement was damp and cluttered. Old chairs stacked against the wall. A workbench covered in tools. Cardboard boxes along the back, stained with water damage. Klein opened the first box. Church bulletins from the 1980s. She opened the second, receipts for lawn care supplies. Light bulbs, cleaning products. She opened the third. Inside was a stack of spiral notebooks, all with generic blue covers. 10 of them. Klein's pulse spiked. She pulled them out one by one. The first 2 were blank. The third had writing. On the first page, in an adult's handwriting, May 4th, 1993, 6, seats, 7, 12, 14, 18, 20, 2, 2, 2, 18, 2, 40, 1, Bellwood Road, returned. Below that, in the same handwriting, protocol followed. No memory, no trace. Corot, line opened the fourth notebook. Different date. August 17, 1989. 4 children. Seats 3, 9, 15, 21. Returned. She opened the 5th. March 22, 1991. 2 children. Seats 6, 19. Returned. She opened the 6th. October 10, 1985. 3 children. Seats 5, 11, 16. Every entry had the same format. Date, number of children, seat numbers. Time window. The word Bellwood. The word return. Every entry ended with protocol followed. No memory, no trace. Colleen counted 10 notebooks, 10 dates between 1982 and 1993. She did the math in her head. 63 children total. She photographed every page. She sealed the notebooks in evidence bags. She thanked the couple and left. Back at the station, she pulled District 4 bus logs from 1982 to 1993. She cross-referenced the dates in Leonard's notebooks. Every date matched a field trip. Every field trip had returned late. Every trip had involved a bus rolling through the Bellwood Road intersection between 2:15 p.m. and 2:45 p.m. Miss Klein requested the names of the drivers. Some were retired. Some were dead. One was still working. A woman named Ellen Torres, who'd driven District 4 routes in the late 80s. Klein called her. Ellen was 59 now, still driving for a neighboring district. She remembered the late arrivals. She said it had happened 3 or 4 times during her tenure. She said the trips always felt normal. But when she checked her watch, more time had passed than she'd expected. Klein asked if Ellen had ever noticed anything unusual at Bellwood Road. Ellen said no. Just a regular intersection. Klein asked if Ellen had ever met Leonard Goss. Ellen said yes, once or twice. He'd been mowing the church lawn. They'd waved. Klein thanked her and hung up. She pulled the names of the 63 children from the old field trip logs. She started calling parents. Most didn't remember anything unusual. Their kids had gone on a field trip, come home. That was it. A few remembered their kids being unusually tired or quiet that evening. One mother, a woman named Diane Ruiz, remembered her son, Ben, the same Ben who'd drawn the figure in the aisle in 1993, asking a strange question the day after a 1989 field trip. He'd said, "Mom, do you ever feel like you've been somewhere but you can't remember going?" Klein asked if Ben had said anything else. Diane said no. He'd seemed confused, but not upset. She thought maybe he'd had a vivid dream. Klein contacted Ben. He was 39 now, still living in Ohio. She told him about the notebooks. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I went on 2 field trips that ended up in those notebooks, didn't I?" Klein checked her list. Yes, August 1989 and May 1993. Ben said, "I don't remember the first one. I remember bits of the second one. I remember drawing that picture. I remember feeling like someone was there, but I couldn't see them." Klein asked if he remembered Bellwood Road. Ben said no. Klein asked if he remembered Leonard Goss. Ben said no. Klein thanked him and moved on. She requested autopsy records for Leonard Goss, natural causes, heart failure. Nothing unusual, but in his personal effects, logged by the county, was a small note folded into his coat pocket. The note had been transcribed into the file. If found, contact Father Emery, St. Catherine's Parish, Millbrook. St. Catherine's was 60 miles west. Klein called. The priest who answered said Father Emery had retired in 2005. He gave Klein an address. Father Emery lived near a lake now, in a small house with a dock. He was 81, thin and frail. But his eyes were sharp. Klein showed her badge and explained she was investigating Leonard Goss. Father Emery nodded slowly and invited her in. They sat in his living room. So Klein asked how he'd known Leonard. Father Emery said Leonard had been a parishioner at St. Catherine's for years before moving to Ashford in 1963. He said Leonard had been quiet, devout, dedicated. Miss Klein asked if Leonard had ever talked about anything unusual. Father Emery was quiet for a long time. Then he said Leonard believed he'd been chosen. Klein asked what that meant. Father Emery said he believed there were moments when the world folded, when time bent. He believed children could step out of the regular flow and return, but only if someone held the door. Klein felt a chill. She asked Father Emery to explain. Father Emery said Leonard had come to confession in 1994, a year after the Ashford incident. He'd said he'd been holding the door for 30 years. He'd said it only worked at certain intersections, at certain times when conditions aligned. He'd said the children always returned, but they never remembered. Klein asked what conditions. Father Emery said Leonard hadn't been specific. He'd mentioned buses. He'd mentioned crossroads. He'd mentioned the need for someone to witness, to be present at the exact moment the fold occurred. Klein asked if Father Emery had reported it. He said no. He said he'd thought Leonard was confused, possibly suffering from dementia. He said Leonard had never mentioned it again. Klein asked if Leonard had said how it worked. Father Emery shook his head. He said Leonard had only said one more thing. They write it down because part of them knows. But when they come back, the knowing disappears. Klein thanked him and left. She drove back to Ashford and requested every field trip record from District 4 between 1963 and 2001, the years Leonard had lived near Bellwood Road. She found 23 field trips that had passed through the Bellwood intersection between 2:15 p.m. and 2:45 p.m. She cross-referenced them with the 10 notebooks. 10 matched. 13 didn't. Klein pulled the logs for the 13. None had been reported as returning late. None had any incidents noted. She called the drivers who'd handled those trips. Most were retired or dead. The 2 she reached said they didn't remember anything unusual. Klein sat with the data for 3 days. She mapped the dates. She mapped the times. She looked for patterns. The incidents occurred roughly every 18 to 24 months. They always involved District 4 buses. They always involved field trips returning from museums, nature centers, or historical sites. They always passed through Bellwood between 2:15 p.m. and 2:45 p.m. But not every trip that met those conditions resulted in an incident. Only 10 out of 23. Klein pulled weather records for the 10 incident dates. No pattern. Some were sunny, some were cloudy. One was rainy. She pulled lunar phase data. No pattern. She pulled school calendars. No pattern. Then she noticed something. On the 10 incident dates, the buses had all been running slightly behind schedule. They'd left the destination 5 to 10 minutes late. That delay had put them at Bellwood Road at a specific window, 2:18 to 2:41 p.m. She checked the 13 non-incident dates. Those buses had been on time. They'd passed Bellwood Road before 2:15 p.m. or after 2:45 p.m. Klein pulled the 1993 museum schedule. The tour had been scheduled to end at 1:55 p.m. Mrs. Dalton had gathered the kids at 1:58 p.m. They'd boarded the bus at 2:00 p.m. 5 minutes late. That 5-minute delay had put them at Bellwood Road at 2:34 p.m., right in the window. Klein checked Earl's statement again. He'd said the bus had been coasting downhill at 2:18 p.m. when he'd stood to adjust the mirror. He'd said the trip had felt normal after that. But according to the notebook Cassie had written in, something had happened between 2:18 and 2:41. 23 minutes. Klein drove the route again. She timed it carefully. Museum to the Bellwood intersection. 19 minutes at 52 miles per hour. Bellwood to the school, 14 minutes. Total 33 minutes. But Earl's watch had said 75 minutes had passed. Secklin sat at the Bellwood intersection and stared at the church. She tried to imagine what Leonard had seen. Buses rolling through, kids visible through the windows. And then, what? She requested the case file for the 1989 incident, a field trip to a nature center. 4 kids had gone missing. The bus had arrived at school 28 minutes late. No explanation. The kids had been found eventually. Not found. Exactly. They'd been there all along. The driver and chaperones had simply miscounted. That's what the report said. Miscounted. Klein requested the 1991 file. Same story. A field trip to a historical site. 2 kids missing. Bus running late. Miscounted. Every file from Leonard's notebooks told the same story. Kids missing, then not missing. Buses running late. Miscounts. Confusion. No one had connected them. No one had realized it was always the same intersection, always the same time window, always the same inexplicable gap. Except Leonard. Klein returned to the basement where she'd found the notebooks. The couple let her search again. She went through every box, every piece of furniture. In the back corner, under a tarp, she found a small wooden chest. Inside were more papers, church records, maintenance logs, receipts. At the bottom was a handwritten letter, dated October 1963. The letter was addressed to whom it may concern. It was signed by Leonard Goss. It read, "I have been chosen to serve as witness. I do not understand why, but I accept the responsibility. The folding occurs at the crossroads when the timing aligns, when a vessel passes through during the threshold hour. The children step out briefly, but they must return before the door closes. I ensure they do. I write their names so I remember. They write their own because part of them knows, even if they forget, this is my duty. I will fulfill it until I am no longer able." Klein photographed the letter. She sealed it in an evidence bag. She requested psychiatric records for Leonard Goss. None existed. He'd never been hospitalized, never been treated for any mental illness. She requested criminal records. Clean. No arrests, no complaints, no incidents. She requested employment records. Leonard had worked as a caretaker for 40 years. No gaps, no issues. She requested interviews with people who'd known him. The congregation members from Bellwood Community Chapel remembered him as quiet, reliable, always on time. The neighbors remembered him as polite, kept to himself, never caused trouble. No one remembered him acting strangely. No one remembered him talking about folds or thresholds or children. In January 2013, Startling held a press conference. She confirmed that 6 children had vanished from a school bus in 1993, and that new evidence suggested they had returned to the bus before it reached the school. She confirmed that similar incidents had occurred on earlier field trips. She confirmed that all children involved had been accounted for and were safe. She did not explain how it had happened. She did not mention the notebooks or Leonard's letter. The parents of the missing 6 were contacted privately. They were told their children had likely returned within minutes of disappearing, that they'd been on the bus the entire time, that the memory gap had been a shared perceptual error. Janet Lim asked how that was possible. Klein said she didn't know. She said gaps in perception can occur under stress, that time can feel distorted. Janet asked about the notebook. Secklin said it had been written during the gap. Janet asked where they'd gone. Klein said she didn't have that answer. Janet asked if they'd been hurt. Klein said there was no evidence of harm. Janet asked if it could happen again. Klein said no. The intersection was just an intersection. The church was closed. Leonard Goss was dead. Janet asked if she believed that. The case was officially closed in March 2013. The evidence was archived. The notebooks were sealed in a climate-controlled storage facility. Earl Voss died in 2014, age 72, heart failure. In his will, he left a single item to the Ashford Historical Society, the District 4 cap he'd worn for 14 years. Inside the band was a small piece of paper, folded tight. On it, in Earl's handwriting, was a single question. If I looked in the mirror at 2:18, what was I seeing? The Ashford Historical Society catalogued the cap and stored it in their archive. The note was transcribed into their records. No one followed up. In 2015, Janet Lim received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, a Polaroid, faded and creased. It showed a group of 6 children standing in front of a chain-link fence. They were wearing the same clothes from May 4, 1993. Cassie in her yellow jacket. Jordan, Maya, Chris, Nora, all there. The timestamp on the back read 2:38 p.m. Janet called Detective Klein. Klein came to her house. She examined the photograph. She requested forensic analysis. The lab dated the Polaroid film to the early 1990s. The image was authentic, not digitally altered. The location was unidentifiable. The fence could have been anywhere. Klein requested handwriting analysis on the timestamp. The writing matched Leonard Goss's handwriting from the notebooks. Janet asked what it meant. Say didn't know. Janet asked if Klein thought the kids were still alive. Janet said that they came back. Klein said, according to the notebooks. Yes, Janet said. Then where are they? Klein didn't have an answer. The photograph was added to the evidence file. Janet kept a copy in a frame on her mantel. In 2018, the Bellwood Community Chapel was demolished. The property was sold to a developer who planned to build houses. During excavation, workers found a small metal box buried beneath the altar. Inside were 6 items. A navy enamel pin shaped like a rocket, a braided friendship bracelet with green and blue threads, a plastic compass on a lanyard, a silver hair clip shaped like a crescent moon, a frayed friendship bracelet with yellow and brown threads, a plastic name tag reading Nora V. The items were turned over to the county. Klein identified them from the 1993 evidence photos. They matched the belongings of the 6 missing children. The items showed no signs of aging. The pin was still shiny. The bracelets were still bright. The compass still worked. Klein contacted the parents. She showed them photographs. They confirmed the items belonged to their children. Richard Brennan asked how the items had ended up under the church. Angela Brennan asked if it meant Tyler had been there. Janet Lim asked why the items hadn't aged. The items were stored in the evidence locker. No further investigation was opened. In 2019, Ben Ruiz, the boy who'd drawn the figure in the aisle in 1993, contacted C. He said he'd been having dreams. He said in the dreams he was on the bus and someone was standing in the aisle, and the someone was saying, "Write it down or you won't remember." Klein asked if he remembered anything else. Ben said no, just the voice. Klein asked if the voice belonged to Leonard Goss. Ben said he didn't know what Leonard sounded like. So Klein sent him a recording, a snippet from a church service in 1989, where Leonard had read a scripture passage. Ben listened to it. He called back an hour later. He said, "That's the voice." Klein asked if he was certain. Ben said yes. Suckling asked what Leonard had told him to write. Ben said he didn't remember. In 2021, Lily Ortiz, the girl who'd drawn the clouds above the empty seats, contacted Klein. She said she'd been cleaning out her childhood home and found an old notebook from 3rd grade. In the back, on a page she didn't remember writing, was a sentence, "We went through but we came back." Klein requested a scan. The handwriting was Lily's. Klein asked if she remembered writing it. Lily said no. Klein asked if she remembered what it meant. Lily said no. She said she'd been staring at it for days, trying to remember, but there was nothing. In 2023, 30 years after the incident, Skline retired. She'd worked the case on and off for a decade. She'd followed every lead. She'd interviewed everyone she could find. She'd read every file, every note, every scrap of evidence. She still didn't know what had happened. On her last day, she wrote a summary report. She included the notebooks, the letter, the photograph, the items from the church. She included the testimonies, the timelines, the gaps. At the end, she wrote, "The children vanished and returned. The time was lost and accounted for. The evidence exists and makes no sense. I cannot explain it. I do not expect anyone else will." The file was sealed and archived. The 6 children, Tyler, Cassie, Jordan, Maya, Chris, Nora, are still listed as missing. Officially, the case remains open. Unofficially, everyone involved believes they came back. They just don't know from where. Janet Lim is 72 now. She still lives in Ashford. She still keeps Cassie's room untouched. On the mantel next to the Polaroid is the spiral notebook with Cassie's handwriting. Sometimes, late at night, she opens it and reads the sentence again. "The man said to write this down before 2:45 or we couldn't come back." And she wonders if they came back, why doesn't anyone remember them coming home?